Welcome to FAT Liverpool's online conversations framework for resilience. This is the second of a three-part series of online conversations that are bringing together artists, researchers, activists, and educators for discussions and story sharing and idea creation. And the series is being organized in collaboration with Artsformation, which is a European art and technology network. My name is Nicola Triscott, and I'm the director of FACT, the Centre for Film, Art and Creative Technology in Liverpool. For those of you who don't know FACT, we support and exhibit art and film that embraces new technology and explores science and digital culture. We're based in Liverpool, as I said, and our building, which opened in 2003, is home to 3 art galleries, 4 cinema screens, a new bakery cafe about to open, and a bar. Our website is fact.co.uk if you want to know more, and you can find the link to the Framework of Resilience series from the front page. So a few digital housekeeping points just before we start. You can activate the subtitles for this conversation by clicking the button labeled Subtitle CC at the bottom of your screen. The subtitles are produced using artificial intelligence technology, and they're not always accurate. So if you do wish to switch them on, we recommend opening up the transcript option to the side of the screen. We'd love to hear your questions for the speakers. If you want to ask a question at any point during the conversation, just click on the Q&A button and type in your question and press submit. Even if you just have a general question or a technical issue, you can let us know by using the Q&A button for this too, and the team will do their very best to help you out. You can also share your thoughts by tweeting us at fact_Liverpool using the hashtag FFR2021. So I'm really delighted to introduce this session and welcome the conversation special guest for our story sharing around the digital campfire session, which will be moderated by curator Helen Starr, and our guests are Jack Tan, Himali Singh Soin, and Nabil Ahmed. This session, which we've conceived as an exchange of stories about how we engage with time, land, and ownership. What happens if we consider that the planet, the trees and animals, as well as perhaps non-sentient beings like rocks and rivers, have rights? And how can we start to understand time and consequence differently as we go forward? You can find a bit more out about our speakers on the webpage for the event at fact.co.uk/framework for resilience, each word hyphenated. But I'm sure they'll also introduce themselves a bit as we get going. So that's it from me for the time being, and I'll hand over to Helen.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of my wonderful speakers for agreeing to take part in this very important conversation about climate change. My name is Helen Starr, and I am an Afro-Carib Trinidadian cultural activist, really. I guess I'm a jack of all trades because I do everything from producing to writing to mentoring within the arts. My absolute passion is new media technology, and that is because this is a technology that's very close to the particular way in which I think of the world. In order to begin the conversation today, I wanted to introduce the work of the Honorable Sylvia Winter, who is a Jamaican novelist, philosopher, and essayist. Her work combines insights from natural sciences, the humanities, art, and anti-colonial struggles in order to unsettle what she refers to as the overrepresentation of man. Sylvia is professor at Stanford University, and she's one of the first people who I found who really understood the link between climate change and colonialism. She puts it very succinctly when she says that if the global south follows the blueprint of the global north, the planet as we know it will end. So as we know, well, as I found out, the first climate change that was triggered by man was actually caused by the great Genghis Khan. The second big climate change, known as the mini ice age of the 1600s, was caused by the deaths of millions of Amerindian people, my ancestors. And the most recent climate change, which is what we're all talking about, is well recognized to have been triggered by the Industrial Revolution. Where Sylvia is particularly brilliant is she picks out 2 points. She says, yes, there's the Industrial Revolution, but really climate change really took off in the 1950s. And that was a point where countries in the global south began to industrialize themselves. So how do we solve this problem? Sylvia's also particularly brilliant in that she asks us to think about other ways. So she says, rather than thinking of a problem as in moral terms of who's right and who's wrong, that perhaps we can think of a third way to help us through going forward, which is what we want to do to go forward into a better future. So that's my little chat, and I will pass the microphone on to Nabil.
Thank you. Thank you, Helen, and Nicola, Jack, and Himali, and everyone else is fact for organizing this campfire, which is a digital campfire, I suppose we should say. Helen, at this point, just a quick introduction. Is that correct? Yeah. So hi everybody that's out there. My name is Nabil Ahmed, and I run a research dedicated to environmental justice, where we take on really long form investigations into interrogating and producing a body of evidence that are used in various legal and alternative forums. And I'm also currently based at the Trondheim Academy of Fine Art, where I'm conducting research and working on a book. So I'll pause there and hand it over to Jack.
Hi everyone. My name is Jack Tan. I am an artist with a background in law. So my work and my research is really mainly around legal aesthetics and around the idea that the law is an artistic medium. Like, I think of the law as clay because I trained as a potter as well. So I'm really interested in the idea that laws make up society and society is a fabric, and that that law is something that we all can play with, not just lawyers. And so I'm really interested in, but I'm kind of quite geeky about it. So like when Nabil was talking about evidence, you know, I'm really interested in what is evidence, like how do we go about perceiving what we know in the world, materially and visually, and in terms of relationships, and then how we use that perception and when it becomes evidence, for example. So that's a kind of thing that I'm thinking about at the moment. I'm also very interested in, have always been interested in decolonial and anti-racist thoughts, because I have also a background in civil rights activism within the Chinese community in the UK. But I think with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's enabled me to think about colonialism and decolonialism in a new way institutionally. That wasn't kind of open to us before, I feel, but I'm still kind of exploring that at the moment. Over to you, Himali.
Just a moment. We had someone say they missed the beginning bit of what Nabil said about your group Interpret, Nabil. I just wondered if you could just say those couple of sentences again about Interpret. Thanks.
I hope this won't be happening all the time, because then we're going to be always starting in the beginning. So Interpret is a research and design studio. So we're a group of architects, spatial designers, researchers, and we work with various communities and lawyers and NGOs all around the world to work on underreported cases of environmental destruction and damage. We very slowly produce bodies of evidence that are used in legal contexts, but not only in sort of creating other alternative forums, some of which I'll probably talk about a little bit later.
That all
I suppose when you get a chance to say it again, you say it differently. So it's not what I said earlier, but that's okay, I hope.
Hi, everyone. I think it would be very appropriate if we just went in infinite loops of time for this panel. But my name is Himali Singh Soin, and I'm a poet and a multidisciplinary artist. I work with music, with movement, poetry, video, and then create kind of immersive performance environments to do this. My last 5 years have been spent researching the North and South Poles, specifically uninhabited spaces in the North and South Poles, and thinking about ice as a kind of storage or an archive of information, even a kind of elder with a kind of knowledge that is very quickly melting away. So I kind of interrupt these archives with fiction and with poetry and tell stories that have either gone missing, that never existed in the first place, or that perhaps were erased or lost in the very whiteness of the material itself. And now I have moved on to the Himalayan region, which I call my personal third pole, and I'm investigating a potential nuclear leak on a mountain during the Cold War, and a kind of like a spy espionage story. So it's got a kind of historical basis to it, but there's also a personal story in that my father, who's a mountaineer, went up to that mountain and took a photograph, which became a stamp. And so using that stamp, I write a letter from this spy device to the mountain. That's just to give you an example of the kind of embodiments that I'm experimenting with at the moment.
Well, so would anyone like to start, or shall I start with my story? So Nicola?
You go, Helen. You go with your story, Helen. Get us warmed up.
I'll get you. I have to say, Trinidadians, we are actually called the storytellers of the Caribbean. So my story is about answering a question that Nicola actually posed to me about how do we think of time. That's one of the issues at the core of getting people to engage with climate change, right? Because we have to change our behaviors now to make the world better for the future. So we're not necessarily going to see or reap the benefits of what we do now in our lifetime. So how do we begin to begin this journey into the future? So this is a story that actually started during lockdown between two wonderful friends of mine, Arietta Dalu and Salma Noor. And we were trying to think of a futurism which was rooted in the global south, which wasn't geographic, which wasn't specific to race and ethnicity. And we came up with this idea of an entity which was the sandstorm from Somalia, which is where Salma is from, and how these sandstorms wrap around the globe. And the interesting thing about the sandstorms from the Sahara is the soil in the Amazon, which is where I'm from, is very poor. But over the centuries, the sand from Africa has nourished the soil in the Amazon and has allowed us to live and grow through the centuries, through the millennia, actually. And these sandstorms also bring the monsoons in India, which is where Arietta is from. So we thought that this would be a wonderful entity to start a conversation about what connects the three of us. And through lockdown, one thing I noticed was how comfortable the three of us were talking about ancestors and ancestral time. Now, this is something that's very common to people in Trinidad. We talk about our ancestors, we embody our ancestors, we commune with our ancestors. No one in Trinidad will open a bottle of wine or scotch without pouring a drink for the ancestors. Our ancestors live with us, they're walking with us. And when I was coming to live in London for the first time, my mother sat me down and she told me a story. And the story was of the group of West Indians who first arrived to live in the UK. And they were hospitalized, and there was a scandal where they were hospitalized and they were thought to have been psychotic because they would talk about their ancestors, and it was quite a political scandal, and it took our government a lot of diplomatic talking to explain to the British that West Indians were not, in fact, mentally ill. And so over lockdown, in conversation with Arietta and Salma, I began to realize that it's something that really distinguished us from the Western way of thinking. So I began to think about long time, because the thing is, when your ancestors walk with you, you are also aware that you will also be an ancestor in the future. So you not only think about your ancestral longevity, but you think about what you will bring to your ancestral lineage yourself. So that is something I wanted to talk about. And in talking about like how we make law, there's a wonderful story about known as the Arietta of Magura, which was told by Bartholomew Las Casas in the 1500s about the two neighboring tribes in Hispaniola, And there were two tribal leaders. One was called Maya Bena, and the other was called Guarno X. And they were, Guarno X wanted to join his tribe to Meobex's tribe because they knew that Columbus was coming to attack. And in order to do this, Guarno X shared his sacred ritual, which was called the Arietta of Magura. Now, this sacred ritual is a performance complex that is still practiced now in Trinidad as part of our carnival. And it's a sharing of movement, dance, and oral histories. But it's more than that. When you share your Arietta, you become joined, your ancestors become joined to each other. You then become like family to each other, and it's a contract that cannot be broken. And the thing that's very hard to explain about this sort of sacred ritual, which we still practice today in the Juve part of Carnival, is this performance is it enacts a shamanic trance, and you actually shift from the left side to the right side of your brain, and you move into a space which cannot be explained or described within Western thinking. So I wanted to lead the conversation with this idea of contract, and following on from Sylvia Winter's asking us to think of a third way of becoming kin with each other, to present the idea that if we dance together, that we would understand that we all ecological beings who are part of humanity. So that's my story. Shall we go next to Nabil, who I read an essay that you wrote, Nabil, which I will put into the PDF, which was about the situation in Africa with the pollution. I think it was in Eflux, the article, and I just thought, in terms of illustrating the complexities of climate change, I mean, how do you even begin to think about navigating these problems? I mean, what would you say?
Thank you, Helen, for the really beautiful introduction, sort of bringing us sort of together. Just a quick technical note: my internet connection here is not the greatest, so if it's getting wobbly, I'll turn off my video or have to switch over to my own connection. Well, I thought this image of the campfire, right, where just something that we discussed when we were sort of had our pre session on today, and it's a quick story about a fire around many of us sat a number of years ago in up in Tromsø, which is further north from here, in here Norway, and perhaps how we came to sit there together and what we said there that day is a little bit
Nabil, I'm going to stop you, and
piece,
Nabil,
maybe
Nabil?
Maybe.
Nabil? I'm going to, oh, okay. Nabil, I'm going to stop you and let you switch to 4G.
Yeah.
And then while you're doing that, move on to Himali. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds good. It happened right on cue. Hey, I'll try to jump onto my phone.
Okay, I'll take over in the meantime. I thought staying with Nabil in the Arctic, just a little bit higher than Tromsø in Svalbard, I thought I'll read a little piece from my book, which flips both ways. So it is kind of looking at different ways of time and different ways of reading time. But the piece, the reason why I chose it is because there was this moment when we were on the ship, which was a tall boat, and we were sailing. The motor was off, and the weather, there was a kind of storm picking up, and the captain got nervous that we didn't know very much about the ship. So he took us out all on the deck of the ship and drew the ship in chalk. And he started to explain every part of the ship so that if something were to go wrong, if all our measurements were to fail, we would know the parts of the ship. And I had this kind of meta feeling when the boat kind of rocked and I fell a little bit. And I had this feeling that I was becoming part of the boat. And therefore I was becoming part of the water. And I was with the land. And so this piece is called Boatness, and it's almost a manifesto about using intuition as a method and being able to use love as a form of critique. It's about the moment, very fleeting, when the mind and the body, that duality, meets itself and then passes on. And it's about the moment when your experience of the world and your knowledge of the world and you are just momentarily one and the other. Boatness. There is nothing to tell us that time has passed. The sky has not shifted, no shafts of sun, no heat, no dead darkness. We have become the sway of the boat, the whimsy of the wind in the sails, the squeak of the wood and the rope against the steer, the autopilot correcting the bunt, the binoculars, the charcoal-smudged coastline. The captain is explaining the parts of the ship by drawing the ship on the deck in chalk. Meta is not even the word here. The boatness of the boat. We wait for Theseus. Is the drawing of the ship on the deck of the ship now part of the ship? The surface part of the sea, chalk part of chalk, part of the assembly of the ship, part of the time of the ship. 12 p.m. meaningless, 3 meals a day without a job or a city, a routine without a route, part of the analog mountain pixelated in the water, part of the premonition, part of the rhythm of the ship. She, the rhythm of the body, the adjustment of the body, the adjustment of the ship, histories erased by white, histories that never occurred, the failed experiments, evaporating permafrost, closed mines, the fallen balloons, the runaway fox, the last shipment, the flooded seed bank, all conducted by clocks that do not know their part in it. The drawing of the ship on the deck of the ship is, therefore, an ocean in the ocean, the diagram of an eclipse, an S that needs only an apostrophe to plural, the myopic astronomer, all the while knowing that to draw a ship on the deck of the ship is to see the whole in a part, in the way that we can see the galaxy even as we are inside the galaxy. The boat is after the ark. It can tell big things from far away, as if it always saw love coming. The strong post of the I, the fragile bend of the T. Love breaking, as if it knew it had made a promise it could not keep. Like inviting a rich guest for a dinner of bones. Like playing the triangle in an orchestra. Like sex after sex. Love like seaweed, unbodied and muscular. Seaweed like old cables uprooted by the elements. Like Antony still sending tired messages at listless frequencies and amplitudes like anthills. Data suddenly poems. Then what? Electricity. Light through the thickness of water gushing through the deck of the ship. The drawing is erased. Only mast and moonraker left to steer the whole hull. This is maybe how love feels. Seaweed in the ocean, seething between shore and shallows, disembodied, arms and legs and eyes everywhere, sinking and drifting. Sending missives to the gridded world, saying, where are the bounds of what you can only sense? Boatness is the thing that sustains till the new love comes. That ellipsis between love and love over and over. I'll pass it on to Nabil so that we can stay in the Arctic.
Hi, everybody. So you'll hear my voice, I hope. Sometimes actually preferable without the image. Well, I just caught the tail end of Himali's really powerful poem, and now I have to ask her again what the beginning bit was, because I was trying to sort out internet connection. But yeah, so if I can sort of jump back to that image, it's really beautiful what Helen said earlier about the blueprint that indigenous people have, and I was wondering, blueprint is a really a term that we use in architecture and infrastructure and so on, plan of something, but where is it exactly, right? Where is it written? And that about that fire that she was speaking about, it seemed to me that that blueprint is in the night sky sometimes. And this was certainly the case up where we were in the Arctic. And this was a meeting that I had initiated and was only possible because many of us collaborated on this together. And many people that are perhaps too many to mention today. But the meeting was to bring West Papuan, the people who are in the occupied, who are occupied by Indonesia, the Indonesian government up to today, to bring West Papuan indigenous leaders and community elders up to the Arctic to meet their counterparts. And the idea was to meet in this quiet place, hosted by the Sami House in the University of the Arctic, to meet their counterparts, as in Sami lawyers, Sami politicians and thinkers, and this was and the Sami people being the indigenous people of the Arctic, one of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic. And the workshop was focused around how do we, kind of riffing off of also what Jack was saying, how do we sort of think and examine different kinds of evidence towards fighting this really big, the world's biggest gold and copper mine that's on the indigenous land of West Papuans, that has been from the beginning the way what belongs to the Papuan people have been taken for decades to fulfill the capitalist's greed of big mining, a mining company called Freeport-McMoRan. And the mine has been at the heart of the indigenous right to self-determination movement that's been going on there for a very long time. So our guest at this meeting was Mama Josefa Alomang, who is an Amungme elder, a woman and a community leader that has been fighting the mine on her land for decades. And when she graciously accepted our invitation and came to meet us, this was her first time coming to the Arctic. And when she came in, we sort of assembled around a fire that our Sami hosts had lit, and with the perpetual summer daylight there, and the fire, and above the fire was a kind of cosmological drawing that the Sami hold very dear, that shows how they relate to the stars to navigate their ways. But right before the meeting, and this is where perhaps the story becomes really interesting, and how it sort of also connects to representation and art, and how do we relate to one another. This commonality that Helen also mentioned came together in the most beautiful way. I mean, those few days when we were all there together, it was really emotional and really intense. This was a powerful sort of moment, but it sort of set off like this. When Mama Josefa walked into the room, her eyes sort of fell on a print that was in the room, a print made by the Sami artist Brita Marakat Laba, and the print showed a scene of conflict where which was around the struggle in the 70s that the Sami people were waging for a renewed sort of attempt to assert themselves in what is their own land against the Norwegian state, that sort of took shape around river rights and land rights, where environmentalists at the time began to side for the first time with the Sami people. But the tableau that Brita Marakat Laba made showed an icy landscape, white as far as the eye can see. But coming from the far distance in the sky, rained down fairly menacing looking black birds. And these birds, as they came closer to the ground, morphed into policemen. And on the other side of this tableau, this epic sort of scene of struggle, where could not be any more contrasted to this white sky and the black cops, where the Sami people wearing their really colorful the colorful sort of costumes and their dresses, and these two groups sort of met in this hand-to-hand combat right in the middle of the picture. So Mama Josefa stood there and was sort of taking it in, and she didn't know about this artist. And as I said, it was the first time coming to the Arctic, and they came because of this chance to be able to tell their stories in this new way. When she took a look at this picture, she said, she turned around to us, and she said simply that this happened to my people, right? And this was happening in the south, in the mountains and jungles of the Pacific land of Papua, where the police were rather the Indonesian military raining down bullets and gunfire from airplanes onto the highlanders, where Mama Josefa lost one of her child in that struggle and had to hide in the jungles for a year, she told us. So it's really sort of a set the scene for the conversation that was to follow, around how new kinds of satellite images and the remote sensing investigations that we had been carrying out for many years, the way of bringing together lawyers and activists and scholars and artists, and in having this being part and infected by this horizon of the self-determination of the West Papuan people. The story to end began with an exhibition, and it was also punctuated by another one, and it connects Liverpool too. I thought to myself, which is that before this meeting, which was held in secret, the organizers, my close friends from the Office for Contemporary Art, who helped us make this event happen, had well, we decided that it was not going to be publicly made available or publicly publicized at all, because we were on our we were nervous, because the last time we had met was, or we had tried to meet, was at the United Nations, and it was with my friend, the late Polly Higgins, where we had tried to organize an exhibition on our forensic investigations on the slow motion genocide and the environmental destruction in Papua, bring this to the notice of the International Criminal Court. A forum, again, may not be the best suited for the ills that the world faces today, but nevertheless brings some hope. And that event, that exhibition that was supported by the government of Vanuatu, and where we had invited Octo Mote, the then leader of the West Papuan independence movement, was blocked by the Indonesian government. And I have not been back in Indonesia since, a place that I love in many, many ways. So this was the next, so the exhibition, in fact, some of which was also, of course, presented and thought through in an exhibition we also made at Arts Catalyst in London. And then the story then moved to Liverpool, where we managed to ship this censored exhibition to the Free West Papua campaign, and the exhibition was then restaged as part of the Corbyn years Labour Party conference that took place in Liverpool a couple of years ago. So, well, I'm just trying to make some connections here, and how all of these things sort of join up. And I'd of course heard about Jack's work then from Nicola. So and Himali I know from a long time. And but I suppose to end it, I think I have to say my biggest pleasure of today is hearing Helen, because we had not known each other before, and I hope it's the beginning of many more conversations. So I'll end there and hand over back to whoever.
It was very beautiful. It's tempting just to switch our cameras off, isn't it, and sit in the dark and listen to the stories.
So I'm quite lost for words from all of this. So I'm delighted to hand over to Jack.
Just so many things. Just like it's like kind of spark like fireworks in my head from everything that everyone's saying. I think I suppose the most immediate thing that kind of prompts me from what Nabil was saying was just my real interest in what he was saying about how you're trying to examine the different kinds of evidence to fight the global copper mining. And the thing about evidence for me is evidence is a kind of contested ground on whether something is recognized or not, and by whom. You know, that's what evidence is, because what we accept as evidence today is based on positivism. It's based on what is quantifiable, what is scientific, what we call rational. Knowledge that comes from feelings or histories or stories or dancings, I think, are not evidence. And so I'm always aware of what's allowed in the courtroom as information and what's allowed in the boardroom as correct information on which we can make decisions. And I'm also always really aware of the way in which that information comes with a inherent ordering. So the ordering of linearity is allowed, but the ordering of mess is not. The ordering of voices, of the ordering of the way in which certain bits of knowledge are offered spoken by people with letters after their name is allowed, but orderings that come from the ground, from people who don't have letters after them, from indigenous knowledge, kind of isn't allowed. And I'm trying to mix that up, you know, because I'm kind of becoming more and more aware that the orderings that I'm used to are something that is part of a kind of colonialism that has happened since, I suppose, the 17 or 1600s, you know. Maybe I could also offer you something, a story from my youth, from like when I was pre-Christian, shall we say, because our family is originally Taoist, but I say Taoist in the sense that it's not the philosophical Taoism, but a kind of Taoism that's based on animism and gods and stuff like that. But then, being a good kind of colonial family, we converted when I was about 14. And in fact, I was the one who converted my family, to my utter horror nowadays. But that's another story. But I think I wanted to kind of say that when Helen was saying that our ancestors walk with us, it made me remember that time when I was 6 or 7. And I try to remember my ancestors, and ancestor worship or ancestor veneration is really important in Taoist culture. And I try to remember our ancestors were basically text. So they were these plaques in the family altar with their names on. No pictures, just their names inscribed in these wooden plaques. And as a child, I always thought, oh, those are my ancestors who we, you know, pray to and everything, but there's no image, it's just text. So my ancestor was text. And then I realized that I am my ancestor, or I am ancestor. In fact, it's more ontological than that. I am ancestor because my name, I share my name with my ancestors, so my family name. So my name is not Jack Tan, actually. My name is Tan Jack Key. That's my official name. But just the anglicized version is Jack Tan because of like passports and stuff. People can't cope with this idea of your name having an order that isn't the Western order. So Tan being the family name comes first. Jack being the generational name. So I share the name Jack with probably hundreds of people in my generation, in my clan, and Key is my real name. So I am ancestor because I shared these two bits of my name with my ancestors and my generation. And therefore, my ancestor is also text, which is so weird. And then it made me realize, it made me remember that so much of the religion that I grew up in was in text. So I went to a Catholic school in primary school, and there was a, you know, like as kids, right? Like in when you're 11, when you're like 6, there was a rumor that the boys' toilet was haunted by a nun, the ghost of a nun, who would sit on the fan in the ceiling, whirring around, staring at you. So we were like really scared. And so I was freaked out. My mom went to the temple and got me a talisman. And the talisman was just a poem written on a piece of yellow paper and then folded up in a triangle, which I kept in my wallet. So it was like I carried text around me as protection as a child. And then the other thing that happened once in a while also, which I thought was really weird and slightly gross, was that we would get these specific talismans on auspicious days, which was like a piece of tissue paper with a kind of a phrase written on it. And then what we would do is burn it in a cup, and the ashes, then you fill water, and then you drink it. And then that was meant to protect you. The water protects you as a sacred thing. But it was as if you were ingesting text. And that was really interesting as well. And so I think phrases and poems kind of formed a kind of magic. And to bring it back to the law, phrases and poems were kind of magic, and we put them on our doors as well, you know, to ward off spirits. And so they were kind of magic to me, but law is a kind of magic. Law is in text as well. And law has this kind of performative power. So there's a sense in which the law becomes a talisman, but it's actually quite powerful talisman because the courts and police and sanction falls behind. So there's a kind of, the law's like kind of very powerful poetry with an army and a police force behind it almost. You know, it's kind of weird. But I long for a time when text didn't just exist in statutes, but exist in my wallet or on the door frames, or that I drink it. You know, like I wish the law was more performative in that way, more shamanistic, I suppose. Anyway, I don't know if that's relevant at all. It's probably not, but this is just kind of thoughts that around the campfire, I suppose, that intrigued me.
Jack, I just wanted to say I love that. I love the idea of drinking your poems, and text is protection. But what you said about evidences also had me thinking about all these moments in the Arctic where you could see the permafrost had evaporated, and below either you see whalers' graves that have come up, similar to what Nabil is saying in terms of mining. There were lots of like little mining paraphernalia. You would see fossils of sharks, reminding you that maybe where you were was possibly under the ocean at some time. But the way that the permafrost had evaporated, there was a kind of decolonial tendency to that too. It was revealing to us some of the violences that have actually been embedded in the earth. But what do you do then when the evidence is a material that is inherently ephemeral? What do you do when the evidence is ice or land or the shifting nature of the earth, right?
Yeah, Himali, I wanted to ask you also, because you said kind of almost in passing, but I thought was the most important thing to me, which was you said the ice was elder as well. Like, so in the sense that ice was not just evidence, you know, like an object that we mine for information as well, but ice as a kind of a being that has a story to tell and has a personhood in its own right. I just thought that was really interesting. If you had any thoughts, more thoughts about that.
I wanted to talk about this idea, which is, I think, one of the problems with climate change and people really understanding climate change is that it's ephemeral in a way. You know, it's not something like blackbirds. I mean, it is like blackbirds coming down on us if we have an imaginary, but it's also a very subtle thing, like the evidence for it can be dismissed. And I wanted to talk about, to mention that in science, in an area called epigenetics, in our biological code, which is just data, they're able to pull from the blood of people. They can tell from your blood if your grandparents have been in the Holocaust. So you can now use data that's in your DNA as evidence to ancestral trauma. So this idea that our ancestors are in us and walk in us is not an ephemeral idea. And so how do we really begin to embody the notion that if we don't change our behaviors, then the world as we know it is going to be destroyed. We committing what Nabil calls ecocide. I think it's closer to suicide. So I'll leave everyone with that. Leslie has started putting in questions from the audience. So this one is very interesting. How do you feel about the Stop HS2 protesters using non-violent direct action by locking on in tunnels they have constructed under Euston Square Gardens in London? They are now raising awareness of the ecological climate breakdown happening now. So I'll put this question to Jack, because I think that's interesting from a legal, you know, from a legal, you know, I mean, I'll just throw it out there. I don't really think that it's going to change anything.
So I'm just trying to understand whether the question is more about the non-violence, direct action by locking on in tunnels. I think the questions about the effectiveness, I suppose, for me, about protests, because I don't know. I think it's really important that protests happens as a form of, I suppose I view it as a form of kind of poiesis, like protest as a form of an overflow of something that needs to happen. I think that protest tends to get the system, shall we call it, the whatever the system is really good at responding to the protests, and in fact, even at some points appropriating the protests. So, I mean, I moved to the UK when I was 7, and then my mum had a haberdashery stall in Brixton Market, and in 1981 the Brixton riots happened, and my sense of reading how the response to that was kind of public inquiry and locking it down, demonizing the community, So I think it had to happen, but then it was like, how do you respond to it systematically in an organized way? Protest as a part of a greater set of tactics, I think, for the community is more effective, you know. So, and also I was involved in that Million March protests, anti-Iraq war protests. I really thought that we were going to change the minds of the government, because like 1 million people marched in London and it kind of didn't change anything. So, you know, so there's a part of me that goes, I really think people need to protest, but it needs to happen tactically, I would say. Yeah, not sure. Yeah.
Nabil, Nabil, you mentioned some good news about reparation the other day. I mean, I come from a family of political activists and have myself been there for 3 revolutions, 2 coups, and I was there for the Grenadian Revolution. So I do not think that I think if you're protesting against someone who has more power than you, then you will lose. So it's really about how to disperse the power. But Nabil told us in our pre-meeting a lovely story about reparations for the South Pacific, and I wonder, Nabil, if you would share that, if you're there.
Yes, Helen, I am here, but I don't remember which story that was at all.
It was the South. It was the French bombing of the South Seas, and that the people who'd been displaced were finally getting some form of reparation. The islanders.
Okay, yes, I remember, but no, well, I wish that were the case, but I think it's actually maybe the opposite that has happened so far. I think it was a story that I was telling you where we're sharing, where kind of going back to looking at the sky. I mean, we kind of know that Pacific Islanders, you know, distances for them, you know, let's say in this great big Pacific Ocean, you know, which might seem far off and remote and empty, is not really the case. And you know, they deal with the so I mean, from the many people that I've spoken to and what I've read from all the Pacific Studies scholarship, these distances and differences are actually part of life, and people move and have moved around for thousands of years using their own ship technologies and celestial navigations and so on. I think the moment that I was talking about was how well, and that these places were colonized, but that colonization took a more insidious form when after the end of the Second World War, the British, the Americans, and the French tested nuclear weapons or in the Marshall Islands and in French Polynesia. And in the case of French Polynesia, the French, when they named their bombs or named each test after using some of the terminology from the French, from the Tahitian cosmology. So it was a kind of attack that cut through time, space, but also an attack that you know, we seem to think that future generations are under threat, but also the past generations, you know, that equally are brought into the fray. Just a quick thought on the value of protests. I mean, it's it's rather taking in another direction, and it's lovely where you, Helen, what you said about revolutionaries in your family. My eldest uncle from my father's side, he was a freedom fighter in the National Liberation War of Bangladesh, who very recently passed away from COVID and the negligence of our medical system. But one thing that sort of struck me or strikes me is how, and I think this is kind of where law folds in too, right? Where I was kind of interested in what happens when revolutionaries sit down to write constitutions. You know, when that moment where that, you know, where you put down your guns and you pick up a pen. I mean, it's not to say one precedes the other. The gun and the pen always flow with one another. You know, but yeah, I think that's really a moment. And I was also thinking about a text that I read with the philosopher Howard Kegel, you know, a long time ago when I was studying at Goldsmiths. And there was a text from Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, and it was a text where Sartre was kind of freeze-framed a moment, right? He freeze-framed a moment where, you know, the protesters stood on one side and the police on the other. And there was this gap in the middle, right? And you kind of had to choose what you were going to do. And you know, that moment, I think is really about a kind of affect, right? Where it's not, yeah, I mean, tactics are, of course, absolutely essential, but that place, the place where you put your body and what you do is, I think, yeah, well, I don't want to say if it's the right cause, but you know, I think everybody should go out and do that at some point in their lives.
There are quite a few questions coming in, Helen. That should we
Sure.
take a few more?
Yeah.
So there's one where one of our audiences just said that they're curious to hear anyone's thoughts on the relationship between climate justice and racial justice within the perspective of the global north and the global south, which I think is interweaving into a lot of the stories that we're hearing. But I wondered if anyone would like to talk to that explicitly.
I don't think you can separate the two. I mean, the notion of race as an abstraction is just, I mean, this is all about power, right? All of this is about power, and who has the power, and the power belongs to the 1%, and the 1% want to extract from the earth so that, you know, they can go on trips to Mars, and everything else like racism is just a nonsense excuse to do what they want to do. And you know, the race, ethnicity, caste, all of this terminology is in many ways, I think, used to get those of us who are not part of the 1% to squabble among each other so that the 1% can continue doing what they want to do. I think we need to understand that if we don't all pull together, if we don't find what Sylvia calls being human, rather than being genres of humanity, then it's not that the earth is going to die, because the earth is fine. If we all die tomorrow, the earth will be fine, right? It will recover. But why do we do it? I mean, why, when you have the technology to go to Mars, do you not use that technology to get that plastic out of the ocean? For me, I just don't understand a lot of what the problem is. I mean, I've thought about it a lot, and all I can think of is it's simply about power. The Grenadian Revolution, which I mean, I was there when I was 14. I listened to Maurice Bishop, who was a great school friend of my father's. It was a revolution where no one died. Maurice was loved by everyone. The first law that he brought in to Grenada was equal pay for women. He lifted the quality of life for the Grenadians up to an unseen level. And he talks about the fact that he knows he's going to be killed by the Americans. He says he's a danger. He is a danger to the West because he speaks English, and he has shown that by shifting resources to enrich the lives of people, you can raise the quality and standard of living. And about a month after he gave that speech, Grenada was invaded. His body, his girlfriend's body, 20 of his ministers were taken by the Americans. And to this day, his daughter is still fighting to get her father's body back. The Americans will not give it back because they say they do not want his grave to become a shrine, to become a place of protest. Now, Grenada is an island of 40,000 people. What possible evil could we be doing to the rest of the world? Like, why were we eradicated? So the only thing I can say to all of this, you know, and race, you know, Grenada is a Black country, you know, it's race and the destruction of the world, how we excavate from Black bodies and brown bodies and Asian bodies, how the global North has excavated from the global South is it's something that I cannot understand. So that's
the other thing we talked quite a lot about in our kind of pre-meeting, which we had to cut off because people were talking so much, was so we're talking now about the division between people, but then we were also talking about the division between, and this relates to another question that's come up, between human and non-human, and the rights of animals and the rights of plants, and perhaps the rights of the geologic, and perhaps the rights of rivers. You were talking about, Jack, when we met.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that at this very point, actually, to continue from what Helen was saying, was that I don't view climate justice and racial justice as being separate. And in fact, I think that the knowledges and the tools that have been developed through racial justice should be at the forefront of climate justice. So things that, you know, the knowledges that we've learned over the years through critical Black studies or South Asian decolonial subaltern studies, I mean, these things should be at the forefront of debates on climate justice, because, you know, the environment, we treat the environment as the other, you know, as a kind of, and we treat the non-human as a colonized person, you know, who we can use and extract and do as we want, the way that they are kind of almost objects or slaves to our purposes. So I think so much that we know from within racial justice could be applied to the non-human, and indeed should be, I think. Yeah. Oh, and then I just kind of also wanted to kind of link back to what Nabil was saying about revolutionaries, like what happens when revolutionaries sit down to write constitutions, in that I think climate justice and racial justice isn't about revolution. It's about a continual practice of resistance, because it's a continuing engagement, because the utopia, I don't think the utopia will ever come unless we keep working at it, right? And it's a constant fight, which is what I think Howard Cahill was also talking about. Yeah, I'll just leave it there as well. Don't know if Himali wants to.
I was going to say that just to link back everything, it feels like the importance of protest seems like the importance of symbolisms, and the loss of symbols means the loss of meaning, and it means the loss of abstraction. The reason why I feel like we're on this project of finding this non-human voice, Helen, you said being human, and I was going to say being non-human, is to find some kind of alliance between the non-human and the human othered. And at the same time, with the awareness that that can never actually happen, a complete empathy, a complete being of the other can never happen. And yet we can be many selves. And I say it in this kind of abstract, almost philosophical language, because I think that's also really important in the very real context of protest and revolution, to keep the power of metaphor and to give us, the global Southerns, the privilege of metaphor and the pleasure of the text.
So another quick vignette, back to another moment in our meeting by the fire in Tromsø. I was just struck by what we have heard around this question of how to embody or how to speak about these different selves and different natures. Our guest, Mama Josefa, at one point said to us that the mountain on which this giant gold and copper mine is located in the highlands of Papua. The mine is located on this mountain, and the mine has cut the mountain up. It has created, it's an open pit mine, so it has created a spiral formation. The mine sends 24/7 giant trucks to the ports of Amamapare, from where the copper and the gold moves around on ships to other parts of the world. I have seen it with my own eyes when I was there, where I was there with West Papuan activists, somehow clandestine, but somehow hiding in plain sight. But what Mama Josefa said was no metaphor. She said that she was the mountain and that she had given birth to it, and they had cut off her head. Yet she was speaking to us with her intact head, from her head, but it was also gone. So this absence and presence at once, speaking where, it was as real as it can be, is something I suppose we also must take into account, right? And I think this is precisely where this notion or this question, what counts as evidence, remains ever as important, because that's almost like a battlefield that is not is a constant place. I mean, I totally follow what Jacques was saying about we get a sense that the Constitution is something that's sort of bound and and sort of all written up and done. But I suppose in reality, you know, if democracy has any meaning left to it, it's never a done deal, right? It's a contract that's constantly being renegotiated. About this is well known, but of course, in the experience of African Americans in the United States, you know, when Martin Luther was marching in Memphis, you know, he was standing with the garbage workers, who are mainly African American, Black garbage workers, and it created this scene of protest where the garbage workers were sick and tired of not getting paid well enough and being treated as rubbish themselves. That they held up signs that said, I'm a brother and a man," which is, you know, or similar narrative, which is similar to the abolitionist narratives, right? And there's a whole history of the environmental justice movement in the United States that is around a kind of that sort of dovetails with the environmental justice movement. I suppose one of the things that I want to be aware of, that if we do say that climate justice and racial justice are well intertwined or one and the same, then we must acknowledge also that then sometimes climate justice doesn't look like what we think climate justice looks like. That it has appeared in many forms and many guises in many of the places in the global South, in the anti-colonial struggles, for instance, and it has been sort of ongoing. So I suppose part of our task, if we do acknowledge that, is also to not think about the climate justice movement as something that just started recently, but something that has been going on for indeed a long time.
I wanted to kind of really pick up also on this idea that she was the mountain, you said, Nabil, and I mean, like within kind of, say, a lot of other cosmological thinking, they make no distinctions between the human being and nature. You know, like in Taoist philosophy, we are nature. There is no separation. So the human is wild. So when especially that we're having some conversations, I'm having some conversations about rewilding as well, which to me is, you know, it's great to introduce beavers and stuff, but my problem with it is a kind of like construction of the wild as if it was outside of us and separate from us. And I'm really like keen on the idea that I am the wild too, you know. It's just a really weird, maybe like a really weird version of the wild, but I am the wild too. I am nature, and we all are. And in that sense, this computer I've got in front of me is the wild too. So this separation between, this ontological separation between us and nature, I think it's a kind of modernist construction, and it allows us to feel as if we're doing stuff to something else and not to us. So when we're excavating the mountain, we're excavating nature, we're not excavating us, you know, and that makes me think that it helps us to feel okay about excavating the mountain, because it has no impact on our bodies, theoretically, but it does, because we are the mountain. And the other thing that I was really interested in what Himali was saying about the loss of symbols, that kind of makes me go back to this question about evidence as well, which is like, we have lost the regime of symbols in the world to a regime of signs, is what I think. And so if we restore the symbolic, and the symbolic is kind of porous to me, like it's, you know, it's representation, but with kind of is representations with fingers in lots of other different places, you know. So it's representation. It's a sign that is connected to everything that comprises it and constructs it. Whereas pure sign is just like, it's a hermetically sealed thing, which we can deal with. And I think if we restore symbol to the meaning of our world, in a way restoring poetry to our world, then when we do stuff to our world, we then begin to understand we're doing stuff to everything that thing is connected to as well, in that symbolic way.
I have a question for Himali about the garden that you're planting on the mountain. The plants to take out the radiation. Would you tell us a bit about that project?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a crazy story, and now that I'm in Delhi right now, as you can hear the traffic outside, I also fear that I could be put in jail for this project, because every day a new person is being imprisoned for merely making things like a toolkit for climate change. But essentially it is rooted in a Cold War spy story where the CIA collaborated with the Indian intelligence to take a plutonium-powered spy device onto this mountain named Nanda Devi. Nanda Devi is the goddess of the Indian Himalayan range. So she rustled up a storm when this expedition went up there to lodge this device, and they weren't able to install it. But they promised that they would be back the next season. And of course, it's still missing. And they say it could be ticking somewhere. Meanwhile, mountaineers have gone there and they say there are these kind of glimmering caves of ice. And the government has sealed the space. My father, also being a mountaineer, went up there, and his expedition took a photograph, which then became a stamp by the Indian Telegraph Service. So the entire project begins with using the stamp as a conceit, and the spy device sends a love letter, essentially, to the mountain, telling it what it saw. And it's written as a kind of toxic relationship between the two. At one point, the spy device tells the mountain, you are the omniscient narrator, but soon I will be omniscient too. And the idea is that this radiation could be leaking into the Ganges as we speak. So it starts with a letter, it moves on to the stamp actually being exposed to radiation and a whole kind of inflammation into the nuclear sublime as a video. The device was to spy on nuclear missile testing in what is now the Uyghur concentration camp in the Lapnur region in Xinjiang in China. So, the Nagara drums, which are these kind of kettle drums, are common to both the Kumaon region, where the mountain is located, as well as the Chinese region. So we create Uyghur patterns, assuming that the device also may have picked up protest songs from the Uyghurs. So there's a musical component. And then we send healing to the mountain with a healer who's also a kind of visual anthropologist. So she'll use the media that I've made to send long distance healing. And then we have what's called a remedic or a therapeutic garden. But it's complicated because as soon as we plant plants that might absorb radiation, it means the plants are contaminated. So similar to nuclear testing sites that have struggled to create signs and symbols to tell an audience to stay away, we also have to construct this garden, but allowing for the local public to not be further contaminated and harvest any of that crop. So as we're speaking of alliances with the non-human, here we are.
That's such a beautiful project and so full of hope. And doing. Just wondering if there are any more questions.
There are lots of, there are loads of questions. But I thought was really interesting around Himali's story, that there's a question around our familiarity and our understanding with the concept of restorative justice, which, so the questioner is talking about Polly Higgins, again, Nabil, who defended the role of restorative justice when she was talking about ecocide. And of course, we talk about restorative justice in terms of, primarily in terms of the human, but it strikes me in a very poetic way, there's a restorative justice involved in your Tale of the Mountain, Himali. And perhaps we have a responsibility towards restorative justice for the planet.
Yeah, I feel maybe Nabil and Jack can answer this so much more directly, but at first it felt like, how much burden can the artwork itself bear to do so much work? And now suddenly, in an atmosphere of complete repression of freedom of speech, codes and symbols, and using the same devices of espionage within the work, feel like they can actually do something. And it feels increasingly, because so the Serpentine Gallery commissioned this work, and they commissioned it as a campaign. And I thought that was really interesting, not to commission it as an artwork, but as a campaign. And that already, the language of that switched the possibilities of what a work could do on a piece of land.
The restorative justice question is an interesting one, because I kind of think that restorative justice is brilliant, because it really is about a form of compassionate justice or empathetic justice. What I hope, though, is that it stops being something separate from the normal business of the courts. Why isn't normal justice restorative justice? Like, why does it have to be an alternative kind of way of being and doing the law? So it's like really simple for me, like, for example, within the court, maybe like within the court system, in order to ensure objectivity, we don't want to hear things like victim impact statements of a crime, about how the crime has affected a person's life, until after all the evidence is heard, so that we can make a very objective decision, or mitigating circumstances are left till afterwards. So there's this division between the embodied reality of the participants in a litigation from the rationality of the arguments, the legal arguments that go on. So this kind of body-mind split happens within the law as well. And I think that there has to be a way in which we restore body knowledge and empathetic knowledge as rationality, almost, as well, like within processes. So yeah, so, and I think that's what artists do. Like, artists come in, like, try to do that with the different works, you know, like with Himali's work and with Nabil's work as well. You know, we tried to kind of break those boundaries down between what is acceptable knowledge to what is not, really.
I'll turn off the video again so it doesn't kick me off. Just a few thoughts. I mean, yeah, I mean, not necessarily an answer, but just to kind of open it up a little bit more. I think we also have to be aware that this idea of restorative justice is one part of the puzzle. At one level, ecocide has a long history, of course, going back a very, very, very long time, but more recently, the term really began its career in the 1970s in response to the American use of herbicides in the Vietnam War against people and forests and croplands of Vietnam. Right, it was the first time that the ecosystem was a target rather than only human victims, even though scorched earth tactics had been part of war for also a very long time. But there was something different about it. But the term is also rooted in a sense, of also, at least in my case, some of the work that we're doing is that before you can sit down to have a conversation, you have to address the justice issues. You cannot just say, well, it's okay, fossil fuel companies, you've killed millions of people with your products, and you knew about it all this time. But we're willing to now sit down with you. But I think before these conversations can happen, there's also a sense that injustices have been going on or ongoing on. So it's also a thing about wanting to go after the bad guys, and this is where the idea of the penal justice comes in, right? And whether and it's an open question. This is whether colleagues of ours who are international lawyers are dealing with it. At the moment, there's a panel of experts that are meeting to work on defining or coming up with a working definition of ecocide that would be that we could. I mean, I didn't mention earlier, but Interpret and myself were part of the Stop Ecocide campaign. That is doing a very broad work on bringing this issue to not only to the attention, but working to actually take it to the forum of the ICC. But the definition is really important because but it has to be framed in the language of international criminal law, with its high thresholds of high threshold requirements for the intention, the act, and knowledge elements, which I'm sure Jack could also elaborate on a little bit. Yeah, so the restorative element, I think, speaks to my mind, having worked with Polly very closely in the last few years of her life, is a kind of, and this is a sort of something that I brought up in our pre-session, and we need to keep this tension going, right? And I think this is partly why we're here and talking this way. We're not here to say here's the solution, so the way that Himali is sort of weaving, through poetry in her work and these connections, is part of that journey, right? It's not about being so prescriptive, I suppose, because it is about squaring a circle to some extent, because ecocide is about opening up this notion different from rights of nature, but in the context of international criminal law, opening up a kind of space where the environment, Earth, it and its destruction itself can be considered a crime. And we're so far from it because the entire system is anthropocentric. Even when we talk about genocide and crimes against humanity, these marquee crimes that we are familiar with, they always deal with humans. And of course, some of the stories we've been telling show us that those boundaries are not so straightforward. But nevertheless, in the space of law, where I think the idea of this restorative justice comes from is rather rooted in this legal practice and theory around earth jurisprudence, right? Where it's about a kind of care, stewardship and care for the earth, which doesn't always sit so well with international criminal lawyers. So this is why, some of our meetings, some of our campaign work, there will be a whole range of people from hard knock international criminal lawyers who've defended genociders in Cambodia to climate activists who don't really, who have that anger but don't really think in terms of international criminal law, because they want to do something to protect the backyard, but also open up that sense of care to a bigger to a bigger place.
So I've just heard from Leslie that we have 15 minutes left. So if anyone wants to have a final word or final thought.
I think I would just have a final thought that from what Nabil has just said is that it's to me there's a question there about ecocide, which is that for me there is a distinction between justice and law. I think they're two different things. So justice, so law is, you could call it the praxis of justice. It's kind of technical. Law is what we do and we try to do to achieve justice, but it is a different beast and doesn't necessarily do justice. Often it goes off on its own, and law produces law rather than justice. I think we just have to be kind of clear about that. And so with the questions about whether ecocide, the moment, like for me, I don't know much about ecocide, but the moment you put a side to it, it becomes a legal term rather than a justice term, right? It's like homicide is a kind of legal term. So then we apply legal principles to ecocide as a crime. And so then very technically, a crime needs to have motivation. There's two classic components of a crime. It has to have mental intention and it has to have the performance, the deed. So then lawyers try to prove that. So in circumstances of an ecocide crime, I presume you have to prove the intention and you've got to prove the deed. But it's kind of like when you go about doing that in a very technical way, sometimes justice gets lost, right? In that if you're just going about trying to make the law happen. So yeah, so I'm just kind of really aware that law and justice are two different things, and law works in balance with society to kind of try and negotiate what justice is, I suppose. Yeah, there's my final thoughts.
If there's no one else, I'd like to say something about the wonderful Sylvia Winter, and to tell the story that Sylvia is always about finding a third way. So, in terms of who's right and who's wrong, that's where we always seem to get stuck. And she writes about it in her paper called 1492, where she was stuck in a problem where they'd discovered in Jamaica Columbus's settlement. So the Jamaican government wanted to revive the settlement and have it as a tourist site, as a place of history. So history is history and should be told. We all agree with that. But then, of course, all the Jamaican activists were saying, we don't want to honor this terrible place where so much crime had happened. And Sylvia was asked by the Jamaican government to write about this settlement. So she talks about how do you do that and balance two sides. And she said, you have to find the third way. So of course, I'm on the side of the, oh, Columbus is evil, nothing good. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, no, Sylvia, no, there's nothing good. No, but then as you read and at her conclusion, she says another way of saying or reframing the Columbus discovered the New World argument. So some people say it was a force for good, some people say it's a force for evil. She says there's a third way, and she says with Columbus, the two hemispheres came together. And she put so much work into this one simple thought, but it was such a healing concept for me because I understood that without that intervention, I would not be here today. I would not be listening to Himali. I would not have met Nicola. I would not hear from Nabil, and I would not hear from Jack and be here listening to these stories. So there were quite a few questions which relate to the friction of moving through climate change. And I think rather than battling through everything, you know, that maybe we should think about how we dance through it all. How are we going to dance together, and how we get how do we get the government to dance with us? And if we can share our rhythms and find our beats together and become one through this exchange of non-verbal information, then we can find a way and a different path through all of this. So that was my my final comment. I've done a PDF that's on the FACT website, which has lots of quotes and links. I'll put links in from Nabil's amazing projects into the PDF, so everyone can go on. There are links to Himali's book, there are links to Jack's suggestions, so everyone can afterwards, if you like, have an explore. And I just wanted to just say it's just been an absolute pleasure listening to all of you. I've felt close to tears quite a few times, and I'll hand over now to Nicola to sort of sign off for the rest of us. And
thank you, Helen, for that beautiful summation. And thank you, Jack, and thank you, Himali, and thank you, Nabil, for that really lovely conversation. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for what has been the second of our online conversations, Framework for Resilience, which have been supported by Artsformation, which itself is funded by the European Commission, each 2020 research funds. Thanks for all your questions, which we haven't had time to perhaps address directly and explicitly, but I think most of them have in many ways been interwoven into the discussions that we've had. This conversation will be available to watch again on our YouTube channel at FACT, or as an episode on our podcast with subtitles which will be edited following the end of the series. Your feedback is really vital to us, and we would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this conversation and on conversations that FACT might have going forward. So you can tell us what you thought by going to our website, fact.co.uk/digital-survey, which I'm sure Leslie's popping up in the chat, or tweeting us at fact_Liverpool with the hashtag FFR2021. But thank you again. Take great care of yourselves, and I hope to see many of you next week for the third and final online conversation.